Welcome to the Queer Spirit Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Venegoni. Here we have conversations with artists, healers, and activists who enliven the LGBTQ communities and who empower our queer spirits to flourish. My guest today is my good friend, Pavini Moray. Pavini is a somatic sex coach and also facilitates ancestral lineage repair work. Today we talk about transgenerational trauma and practicing being in our bodies. Pavini also shares with us about working with Transcestors, the work of connecting with the mighty dead queer and trans ancestors as a powerful source of inspiration and support. Find out more about Pavini at emancipatingsexuality.com. That's emancipating-sexuality.com. And also at trancestralhealing.com. That's TRANSCESTRAL healing.com. Hi, Pavini. Welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being here today.
Hey, Nick. It's so awesome to get to have a chance to be on the Queer Spirit podcast.
Great. So I wanted to start out by talking to you a little bit about your somatic sex coaching practice. And I know that one of your key values is getting people to really tune into their desire and their pleasure. And I wonder if you could just share with us a little bit more about why that is so important.
Yeah, it's a great question. So yes, I work in a somatic way. And what that means is that the conversation that we're having in my office with my clients is always involving the body, right? So it's looking to the body as a source of wisdom, intelligence, and kindness. And, you know, a lot of healing work we can do can really focus on our intellect or on our psychology and neglect the body. And so especially when we're talking about sex, it really makes sense to include our bodies in the conversation. So that's what I do, is work somatically around sex with folks who are struggling with sex and intimacy and wanting to deepen into their capacity to feel pleasure, to feel even sensation, to be able to be close with others, and to communicate effectively. So saying all that, I think that it's important to know that when we start working somatically with the body, like we often find like, oh my gosh, I actually have a body and I haven't been paying attention to it, right? And so then there's a process around that, around coming to being able to be really nuanced in the conversation that we're having with our bodies. And also there can be, it's like if I haven't been paying attention to my body and then suddenly I start paying attention to my body, right? We start to notice that, oh, maybe there's pain, or maybe there is grief, or these things that I've been kind of not wanting to acknowledge in my body. And so we bring the awareness there. And so then we, start to wake up to those sensations. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So yeah, in terms of the work, it's really centered around this idea that being embodied gives us more access to all of who we are. And that when we are not living fully to the full edges of our skin, the front, the back, the sides, the up, the down, all the spaces, the organs, the muscles, the bones in between, when we don't have access to all of the sensation and the feeling and intelligence that's present, we're actually missing out on a huge piece of being human and the human experience, right? And of course, the reasons that we would not be living in our body, it seems like so simple, like, well, I have a body, I'm living in it, but that's not always true. Like often we're living outside of our bodies, or we're living deeply inside of our bodies. And so like, what is it like to start to inhabit my body in a way that is whole and supports my wellness and supports me being in the world in practice in ways that are in service to my fullest expression of who I am, right? So you asked about pleasure and desire. So huge, complicated topics. And I think it's important here to just talk a little bit about, so a lot of the work I do is with folks who have sexual trauma. I also have sexual trauma. So pleasure and desire get really complicated in that when trauma is present, right? And so something that should be a birthright of just like, oh, it's easy for me to know what I want, or like, oh, that feels good and I can let that feel good. Those things can be really challenging for folks. So a lot of my work is around building the capacity to be with sensation, building the capacity to really be present to all that's occurring in the body. Yeah. And so pleasure it's such a gift to us from nature, right? It's such a gift of wellness. And I really believe that pleasure, it's a healing principle of the world, that when we tune in and when we put our attention on pleasure, that it's almost like we have a greater capacity for kindness, right? Mm-hmm. And that being able to be with pleasure is, again, it seems like super, well, that's what we're supposed to do. That's like, what every advertisement ever sells us, right? Is being with pleasure. And so, but being with deep pleasure and really letting in goodness is something that is very challenging, I would say, for many people. And we're not even necessarily super aware of the ways that we disclaim pleasure, or we push pleasure away from us, or we rush through pleasure. Like, have you ever, gone to a really lovely restaurant and ordered something from an amazing chef, and then you're eating it and you're just eating it to get through it, right? And that's what a lot of the sexual pleasure that happens. It's like there's not a savoring. I'm definitely not trying to be judgy about this, but wanting to suggest that this idea of savoring is healing. That when we can be in our bodies, be fully in our bodies, and be fully present to our sensations, and we have to develop the capacity. That takes time. That's practice, right? When we can do that and we can savor that, then the things that are contractions, that are brittlenesses, that are difficult to bear in our lives, our attention is off of those things, right? So it's like more freedom and more choice, because we're choosing where we put our attention. And when we're putting our attention on being available to receive pleasure, it's just a whole different game. What I mean by pleasure here is like this really deep, nourishing pleasure that feels good now. It feels good later. It's not in any way harmful to one's system. Just it delights and nourishes on a deep cellular level. Mm-hmm. That is what's healing, of like, oh, I am actually worthy of receiving that kind of pleasure.
Mm-hmm. Now, one thing you said was we don't always live in our bodies. And I think that there might be some people listening who can identify, and some people, they're like, what do you mean I'm not living in my body? And, something else that I've heard you talk about is the practicing being comfortable, being uncomfortable. And I think that for some people, being in their bodies is uncomfortable, and maybe it has something to do with not being okay or feeling worthy of receiving pleasure. But I wonder if you could talk more about how you work with people to get comfortable being uncomfortable in their bodies.
Oh, it's a super hard sell.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
Because what are we getting comfortable being uncomfortable for the sake of being more uncomfortable, right? Why do I want to be uncomfortable? Why would I want to be uncomfortable? That's ridiculous. Didn't you just talk about pleasure being healing, Pavini? Right. Right. And again, it's our capacity to be with ourselves in all of our experiences. Mm-hmm, so that discomfort becomes just another arena where we're present with ourselves. We're not abandoning ourselves. We're not shaming ourselves. We're not wishing it was different. Mm-hmm. We're profoundly with ourselves in all of our experiences. And this is, I would say, radical. Yeah. And so maybe the question is, how would I even know if I'm not living in my body? Mm-hmm. Right? Because it's just like, I'm just going along with my life, and how would I even know if I wasn't living in my body? And what I see in my clients is this, it's like they know something's missing, right? They might not know what's missing, but they just have this sense of I am something I hear all the time is I know I'm capable of more pleasure than I'm actually feeling. I've heard that from so many people. It's well, how do you know that? Right? Mm-hmm. Unless you are on some level tracking, I'm not living fully in my body. I'm not living fully in my experience. So getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, it really that practice. And so what it looks like in practice, let me just back up for a sec, is that when I'm having an unpleasant experience, how I am with myself about that is noticing first, acknowledging, and then I'm really super sweet with myself of oh, Pavini, yeah, you're feeling really irritated right now. This is really sucking right now. but I'm not necessarily trying to get out of it. I'm not saying like, oh, well, maybe I should have a beer, or maybe I should like check my cell phone. I'm just noticing the sensations that's happening on a body level, right? I'm really tracking like, oh, where do you feel that discomfort? Like, oh, what is it like? Is it like a contraction? Is it like are you feeling it in your throat? Are you feeling it in your butt? Like, where are you noticing that discomfort? I think culturally we're taught to turn our attention away from things that are uncomfortable, both in our intellect and on the body level, right? So when I'm turning my attention away from what's uncomfortable, again, I'm missing out on all of the information that's available to me if I turn my attention towards it. And the ironic thing is like when we turn our attention towards what's contracting and we add love, that so often that thing that has been so uncomfortable, it just kind of relaxes, right? That's the counterintuitive medicine of this practice of turning towards discomfort is like, oh yeah, when I just notice that tightness in my throat, like and I'm just with myself and I'm not like shaming myself. I'm just with it. Like, oh, like where'd it go? Right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I know another big aspect of your practice that you weave into this work is working with ancestral lineage repair. And one of the things that I know that you have coined, as far as I'm aware of, is the term Transcestors. I wonder if you could share what that is and how you bring that into your work.
So this idea of gender that is our current Western binary system that we're either dwelling in or dwelling on the outsides of and in various ways, it's not that old of a construct, right? And it's a very culturally specific construct. So this is not this experience that we take as so essential, right? Oh, our gender is just what we are. It's not, it doesn't have that grip in other times in history and in other places in the world. There have been times and places where there's much more fluidity around that. And so, we all have ancestors. Every single one of us alive is here as the result of ancestral sex, basically. So that's part of the tie-in for me. And we'll talk more about the other part of it in a little bit. So we all have ancestors, and, our ancestors can be like the people who we knew who have died, like our parents or our grandparents or our great-grandparents, right? But then also there's all this, thousands and thousands of generations of humans who we didn't know. And even before humans, like other, organisms. So we all have an ancestral past. And it is ludicrous to think that in these millennia of ancestors, that those of our blood have not had every possible experience that can be had as humans, right? So what that translates to is that we all have ancestors who had complex, nuanced relationships with gender in terms of their times and their cultures and their places and their religions and their whatever, And so I've started to talk about the experience of being trans or gender nonconforming as being gender blessed. And it's true because we receive these blessings of a gender liminal experience from these more ancient ones who also had similar experiences or the same experiences or different experiences, and our Transcestors is it's like a shorthand to talk about those ancestors who have wisdom to share on this topic, and not just wisdom, but can offer, especially queer folks or trans folks or gender blessed folks, can offer a sense of understanding for struggles that we're facing, as well as belonging. Yeah. And I feel like that's part of it's a huge piece of the queer wound is around belonging and not having a sense of belonging, at least in Western North American culture. So when I talk about Transcestors, I'm really talking about those ancestors in your bloodlines and of not just in your bloodlines, because there's other ones like Lou Sullivan and Marsha P. Johnson, who I work with, the mighty trans dead, I would call them, who offer blessing, goodness, wellness, and can help support us in our struggles that we're facing in our own times and places with gender.
And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit more then about transgenerational trauma as far as the ancestral repair work goes, and how you work with people with that and bring that in.
Yeah.
Especially around the sexuality piece.
Well, this is what was happening is in my sex therapy practice, I was working with folks with sexual trauma, and we would be making these like really profound healing movements towards sexual wellness. And then there would be these pieces that I couldn't figure out how to get at, right?
Mm-hmm.
They would be like, I am, doing really well in my sexuality and my intimacy and my ability to feel pleasure. I'm feeling so much more embodied. And there were just these things that were like residual that we couldn't quite figure out how to address. And that would be like, but I still feel like I'm carrying, I know that my mom was sexually abused as a child, or I know my grandma was raped, or I know that, my great-grandfather, whatever, was a sexual predator even, and so there were still these pieces that were present. And so that's actually how I came into the ancestor work, was like, okay, so this is what's presenting in my room, in my office, and how are we going to work with this? And so which led to this big exploration of ancestors and transgenerational trauma. So I think first thing to understand is that transgenerational trauma is a real thing. There's a lot of research done on it, especially around the Holocaust and Holocaust survivors and the impact of trauma that you yourself did not experience, right? And so a lot of folks think, just about trauma in general, they're like, oh, that happened so long ago. Like, even if something happened to them in their childhood and you probably deal with this in your office. They're like, but that happened, like, that was 30 years ago. Why is it impacting me now, right? Like, what? It didn't just like go away? Well, it's the same thing with transgenerational trauma. It doesn't just go away. So it's passed in really specific ways. So even if I never experienced starvation, for example, I might still have a lot of unexplained behaviors around food scarcity if one of my ancestors within the last 3 to 4 generations had experienced starvation. So the mechanisms for transmission of transgenerational trauma are biological through epigenetics, and that's when certain genealogical markers get turned on or turned off, which then change how an organism responds to stimulus. So they're not changes to our DNA exactly, but they're changes to the markers on our DNA of like switches get flipped on and off. So, and there's been the epigenetic research, a lot of it has been done on animals, but basically they've tracked changes in behavior and in biology for 4 generations in different studies in animals. So biology is one piece of it. And trauma is also transmitted through behaviors that we observe as children in our families of origin. And so we're just like accepting that this is a normal thing, right? So if let's go back to the food scarcity thing. If there's food scarcity in the house, and not real food scarcity, but perceived food scarcity, and I grow up with that, I just think that's just the way it is. And so then I pass that on to my children, right? If there's like anxiety about certain things, that's another one that can really get passed on. So it's passed on in behavior. And then it's passed on also through the absence of information, through silence. And this is a little mysterious. And it's also very well researched that, when atrocity has happened, when horrific things have happened in families, like one response is to turn away from that information. So it's too horrible to talk about. So this was, in the Holocaust, it was too horrible to discuss. And so we're just going to go start a new life. If we have survived, even though we've lost many people, we're going to go, start a new life in a different country, and we're never going to talk about that again. Right. And so, but the children notice that absence of information. They notice the absence of pictures. They notice the absence of stories, and they know not to ask. That silence is prohibitive to questioning. And so that becomes internalized. That silence is a mechanism of how trauma can become internalized. Yeah. So I think that once we start holding a frame of like, oh, some of the trauma that I am living with is not actually trauma that I myself experienced, it doesn't make it any less real. It's still absolutely real. Then we can start to look at, oh, now that I see it through that lens, what can I do about it? Right? How do I start to work with transgenerational trauma? Yeah, and that's one place that ancestor work can be super helpful in resolving some of the unresolved traumas that our ancestors bequeathed to us.
And I know that a year or 2 ago, I can't remember now, that you actually did your own journey and quest to learn more about your own queer ancestors and went to Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if there's anything you want to share about what you learned and how that applies to what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think with the ancestor work, it's super interesting because we can work with it on the body level. We can work with it on the genealogical level. We can work with it on the DNA testing level. We can work with it on the transpersonal level, like trans meditation. And then we can also, go put our body on the land that our ancestors lived on. And each of those has benefit for kind of building a ancestral database of knowing inside of us. So yeah, I, as part of my process with my healing my ancestral lines, went to Scotland and England and did pilgrimage and did a lot of genealogical research to find out the actual places where my ancestors had lived and walked and did ritual, and just went there and really put my body on the land. And the practice was about listening to the land, listening to the sacred sites that I visited, and listening to, it was really magical. I came back with a folder full of probably 400 raven feathers, because everywhere I went, there would be raven feathers. And I started to realize this is my ancestors talking to me. All right, so I'll start picking them up. And then I started to notice that if I was on the right, I was following the intuition correctly, there would be feathers there to prove the point. Or if I was I don't know where to go now, there would be a raven feather just pointing the way. So in 3 weeks I found 400 raven feathers. I don't know. That seems a little weird to me. That seems excessive amount of raven feathers.
Like your ancestors were leaving you breadcrumbs.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah, they really were. And so that practice of learning to be in relationship, because they're invisible. I can't see them, right? I can't hear them. They can't sit down and have coffee with me and be here, Pavini, here's some things that you should do, right? So it's how do we communicate across the veil? How do we actually, and a lot of people have, amazing ancestral dreams. That's not so much true for me. So really learning to speak their language on their terms. Yeah, I highly recommend pilgrimage just because it gives you a sense of place at least it gave me a sense of place of I belong to this land base in a particular, on the bone level, right? That's not my experience living here in the United States. I mean, I belong to this place in a different way, but the bone level, that's thousands of generations of my ancestors, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Super helpful.
Yeah. So I know that you work mostly with queer and trans folks, and I wonder if you notice any common issues specifically to queer people that you've worked with around the ancestral work that they're coming in with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, I think it speaks to the wound of belonging, and that shows up for folks in different ways, right? But it's this sense of just not feeling home ever, not feeling like I can rest, not feeling like I can ever truly relax, not feeling like it's safe to trust people, not feeling like it's safe to trust myself. I would say that, and especially I think for the gender blessed folks who I work with, the sense of, do I get to be here? Do I get to be here? And then the secondary question is do I get to be well? Or do I owe allegiance to some toxic loyalty of suffering because I've been told that I'm less than, or the experience of this marginalized group has been oppressive, right? Or been oppressed. So yeah, I think that I want to bring it back to, because I feel like I'm getting a little heady. So I want to bring it back to the body of just the sense of I don't get to live in my body. It's I don't get that. Other people might get that. I don't get that. It doesn't feel safe. I don't get to feel safe, right? I hear that a lot around safety. So something that's interesting to start to unpack is what's the difference between safety and comfort, right? And is it that I'm uncomfortable, in which case we know we've already talked about what the practices are, or is it that I'm unsafe, right? And sometimes it's both. And definitely, in our culture, there is a real physical element of danger for folks who are gender nonconforming. And does that mean, because that's on the outside, does that mean that I don't get to feel safe in my skin when I'm just in my own space or, in my own relationships? Do I not get to have that? And so reclaiming that right to sovereignty and safety in my own skin, that I get to take up the fullness of my space, that I get to have the fullness of my experience, that I can be with myself in the fullness of my experience, is a lot of, I would say I see a lot of that in my practice.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah. And just kind of the implications of the trauma that people hold and how it gets held in the body, right? And how it gets projected out of the body and onto relationships. I see that a lot too, especially in queer and trans community, of how we project our trauma onto each other, right? Like, you're making me feel unsafe by your attitude, or you're making me feel unsafe, right? Like that.
So in wrapping up a little bit here, I wonder if you can just share with us a little bit about a person, practice, or experience that has supported your queer spirit to flourish.
Yes. So I think I'd like to speak to the practice of connecting with Transcestors, which is a primary practice for me. And so I'll talk a little bit about the how in a second, but the benefit of connecting with the mighty trans dead has been this source of righteousness, of camaraderie and struggle, and power, like deep power. So I have, a connection with particular trans dead, or people who were trans or gender nonconforming while they were alive and have now died. And through time, with practice, with relationship building, have developed really strong, intimate connections with these spirits, these ones. And like, they're fiercely supportive of my work. And so when I am at odds for where to go next, or I'm facing some challenge or some negative feedback, or like, I just don't know if I can go on in this work anymore, they're the ones who are, right there. So I'll just speak to quickly to an experience I had with Marsha P. Johnson, who was a trans woman activist of color. And she has been a great source of personal and professional support. And I was having a challenging experience a while ago, and sitting with that and just being with the challenge of it, and was kind of meditating quietly. And she came in, and like, I don't know, what do I mean when I said she came in? Like, it was just like she came into my field of awareness. Mm-hmm. And she was just like, girl, you have to wear your boundaries like a cloak of glitter. And she just like had this cloak of glitter, and she just like shook it out and like put it all over me. And and I just started laughing, like,
it's so
okay.
perfect for you. I love it.
It was perfect for me. It was perfect medicine for me. And like, like, wow, yeah, like, that's how you do it. You don't like stew and ruminate and like be like, oh, that person, blah, blah, blah. You just like, I got my cloak of glitter on, so just really powerful medicine. And so I think that I want to speak to the practice of how to build these connections with the mighty trans dead. And I would say also the mighty queer dead, right? So just like two things. One, there's a process of discernment because the dead can be just like humans, can be super well in spirit, or it can be unwell, like ghosty. And so obviously, if we're looking to the ancestors as a source of resource and support, we want to be connecting with the ones who are supremely well in spirit, highly elevated, just beings of like radiance and goodness, and who have like really done whatever process you have to go through when you die to just be like mighty. And so that process of discernment is one that we each have to undertake personally, but it's basically like, do I, with every cell of my being, trust the wellness of this one? Right. Mm-hmm. And like, or do I have like a little feeling in my stomach that says like, oh no. Right. So if there's a queer ancestor or a trans ancestor that someone's wanting to connect with, one thing I might do would be to have a picture of them, put it in a frame. Don't put it on your altar yet, but just like sit with it and like sit with your own intuition and like lean into your well bright ancestors and ask them like, how well is this one? Is this a good spirit for me to connect with? Is this helpful? And this can be renegotiated at any time. Like, it's not like you're signing up forever to be in a relationship if it's not working out. And then the second piece I want to speak to is that relationships take time to establish, and they take attention. Right? Attention is the currency of any good relationship. And so how we are tending to these dead, like, are we just turning to them when we want something? Like, I used to pray like that when I was a little kid, like, God, please help, like right now. Or am I like taking the time to do the practices of making offerings, of making them food, of making an altar for them, of considering them in my prayers, of, how am I relating with these ones in a way that is a mutually, like, sacredly reciprocal relationship? How am I doing that so that I am giving as well as receiving, and they are receiving as well as giving, right? That's a huge principle of ancestral reverence. And they'll tell you what they want. They'll talk your ear off, and you get to negotiate about that, right? You get to say, yes, you can have, you cannot have, sorry, Marsha, you cannot have a diamond tiara. You can have a rhinestone tiara, like that. Yeah. And so that just like really deepening into the relationships with practice over time of coming back again and again and again and building that relationship so that it becomes a source of support. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what I want to say about like, do your due diligence and then build the relationship.
And for people who want to dive a little deeper into this, you also have a podcast where you explore this more.
I do. Yeah. I have a podcast called Bespoken Bones, Ancestors at the Crossroads of Sex, Magic, and Science. And it comes out every new and full moon. You can find it at bespokenbones.com. And it really came out of the research I've been doing for my dissertation around sexual wellness and ancestral reverence. And I was doing all these interviews, and my dissertation committee was like, okay, you got to stop doing interviews and start writing your dissertation. And I was like, oh, but I love doing the interviews. And so they're like kind of snarkily suggested that I do a podcast, and then I did. So that's what that's all about. And it's really looking at, the intention is to create radiant erotic wellness for past, present, and future generations. And it's looking at how all of these threads, the sexuality, trauma, connection with the earth, belonging, transgenerational healing, ancestral reverence, magic, and kind of all the social justice-y stuff as well. Like how those intersect and how many different ways can we have this conversation around the practices of developing our own wellness? Like what are all the different ways, all the different tools that we can use for the sake of greater cultural wellness?
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And how else can people find you and more about your work and what it is that you do if they want to connect with you?
Sure. So I have a couple of websites. The more sexuality-focused work I do can be found at emancipating-sexuality.com. And then the more ancestor-focused work can be found at trancestralhealing.com.
Great. And we'll have those links on the show notes so people can find them later on. Well, thank you, Pavini, for being here and sharing your stories with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nick. It's been just a pleasure to be here and support your podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Queer Spirit Podcast. To find out more about all the resources we discussed today, find the show notes at thequeerspirit.com. You can also continue the conversation by joining the Queer Spirit Community Facebook group. Simply search Queer Spirit Community on Facebook. See you next time.